Right, so if you read chapter 12 now, we could just talk about it instead. Maybe that would be better instead of me lecturing so much. Yeah, I like this chapter as well, and the exercise that I'm going to hand out today. I don't think there's a lot of other textbooks that put emphasis on this. At least I didn't read it anywhere else. I kind of made it up. But so I don't know if there are other textbooks that do the same analysis. So I need a stick here. So we have here emissions increasing this way. So we have the marginal cost of abatement. Well, you sort of start over here. You sort of notionally think, you go down to Mombasa, you go look at the cement factory, you think they probably haven't done much cleanup yet, so they're over here. And now we're going to start doing some environmental management. So we want to find the optimum level of pollution. And that's where we have an intersection between the marginal cost of abatement and the marginal curve that shows the damage to the environment. And this one is going up because, of course, the more you pollute, the worse it gets. And this one is going up, but starting from here, because the more you're going to clean up, the more expensive it gets. So the optimum is, as always in economics, going to be where these two curves intersect. That's the optimum. That's not going to change. And so we have the optimum quantity. Might be useful to have this over here as well. I drew that from here. So this is the optimum level of pollution. This is the optimum shadow value of the pollutant, which is, when it comes to climate, this is called the social cost of carbon. And I have today, in 1.5 hours, I have an article appearing on that subject in Nature, so I'm very proud of course. And the whole process with Nature, it appears at a certain time. So I'm not allowed to talk about it before 11 o'clock today, or it's to the press. Yeah, anyway, so there we are. We can, this is the, like, I don't know, unregulated emission level. And there are thousands, no, tens of thousands of articles talking about whether we should have permit trade, regulation, or tax to get to this point, right? So it's quite clear we're going from here to here. But I want to talk about these areas here. I didn't use the letter E because I guess E was emissions. Yeah. Yeah, so someone has to pay. These are costs. And the question is, who's going to pay them? So D plus F plus G, what is that? What does that area mean?
Yeah, avoided damage.
Yeah, that's right. That's the avoided, that's why we're doing all this. That's the whole reason why we're talking about this stuff. That's why I did it in green here. That's the benefit of cleanup. And the power of economics is that, in principle, everything is in there. So that's the reason, that's the whole reason, right? We've got all the arguments in there, in principle. That's the reason why we want to clean up the environment. That's the area under the damage curve that we can avoid. What do we have here on B plus C plus D? Take another color for that. That's what a polluter has to pay if you impose a tax. So if you impose a tax, the polluter immediately would have to pay B plus C plus D plus F. That would be a tax payment on the total emissions over here. But he doesn't do that because he's mean, right? That's like the Adam Smith idea. It doesn't have to be green. It's enough that he is mean. He wants to save money, and it's cheaper to do some abatement here. So he pays the abatement cost D and avoids the cost F. And then he's also paying this rent, you might call it, sort of B plus C. So we can kind of think about this for a while. We can sort of say, well, manufacturers and businessmen, they sometimes complain that they have to pay twice for pollution. Right? First, we have all the costs of cleanup. And then we have to pay these taxes. And surely there's no, as long as we do the cleanup, what's the point of we don't want Anders Boy to get all this money and put it in his bank account in Switzerland. I don't know if anybody thinks he's corrupt, but a lot of people think a lot of finance ministers are corrupt and that they kind of steal the money. And so they don't want to speak about B plus C. Some of the very sophisticated, they might even complain particularly about B. They say that B does not even, is not even a damage cost. C is actually a damage cost. I mean, you're causing some damage because it's the area under the damage curve. B, why am I paying B? Yeah, well, it's the same reason, like you pay the marginal price. Well, when you buy ice creams, you don't just pay like the marginal cost of producing one more ice cream. You pay sort of an average price, it is the market price. It is the same for everybody. So it's sort of the rule of one price. There are a lot of mechanisms that are, many of the instruments we've talked about are really there to try to get rid of this B plus C payment. Think of the psychology of this. If the government, it takes a long time to make a tax. In reality, in a country like Sweden, at least, you have public inquiries writing these books, and they're always 1,000 pages, and then they have to be sent around for comment and review. And this doesn't happen overnight, right? This takes a few years. So there's some discussion, there'll be an election, there'll be politicians talk about it. So during that time, the politicians would be pretty stupid. I mean, the businessmen would be pretty stupid if they didn't think about the option of saying, okay, guys, forget about the law, we'll clean up voluntarily. That would mean that they pay D, and they never have to pay B plus C. And that would seem to be an irresistible offer to the politician. Oh, they already cleaned up voluntarily. Corporate sustainable, whatever it's called, responsibility, CSR. Our businessmen in this country are so environmentally conscious. We don't really need to actually pass a tax law. We just need to maybe threaten them a bit that we are thinking about a tax law. But then we don't actually have to do it. And then they will clean up voluntarily, and we don't have to. And I'm sure this works very well in Japan. did I tell you my Japan anecdotes? I don't remember. That's the trouble. I go around, I teach in different places. So I had the opportunity of visiting Japan with a very high-level delegation of Swedish sort of negotiators. This was to celebrate the signing of the Kyoto Agreement. The Kyoto Agreement was actually very much the initiative of a Swedish Minister of Environment, because Sweden happened to be the chairman of Europe. It was, there's a rotating system. This is Kjell Larsson. He signed, he wrote a comment on the back of the former copy of that book. There was a sort of a little thing saying that from Kjell Larsson that every environmental minister should have this book on his desk. So that was nice. Anyway, Kjell Larsson, the United States pulled out of the Kyoto negotiations. Everybody expected the negotiations to collapse. Kjell Larsson was an inexperienced, a new Minister of Environment. And suddenly he said to himself, gee, I happen for 6 months to be the environmental minister of Europe. Sort of, because that's the way this rotates, at least the chairman of, So he sort of asked the Prime Minister, can I use the government plane? I'm flying to Japan. And it's quite a exciting story for him. And he flew to Japan and he persuaded the Japanese that, okay, together with, they persuaded Russia and a few other unlikely countries, and they signed the Kyoto Agreement. The Kyoto Agreement, you had to have half of all the pollutants, all the countries representing half the pollution, which was very difficult when the United States had pulled out because they have a very big share. So basically all the other countries said yes, and it was Kjell Larsson's, was his thing. And so this was about 5 years later or 8 years later or something, the negotiators traveled to Japan to kind of celebrate this victory, which in hindsight is not enough. We don't think this is, but still it was a big deal at the time. It was better than not signing the Kyoto Protocol. And so we got to meet the top people in Japan, including, there is something called the Keidanren. Has anybody heard of the Keidanren? It's very important, so I'll write it down. It's like the association of all Japanese industries, or all the big, powerful ones. And so this is a club for about 50 gentlemen, not many ladies there, and very powerful. They have a cartel. They basically run Japanese industry, which means also South Korean industry, and industry in quite a few other Asian countries. Right? The only other major power is, of course, China. But otherwise, they kind of dominate Asia. And so that's a very powerful club. And we had a discussion, and the guy called Lars Zetterberg, who had taken this course just a few weeks earlier, in fact, so we were traveling in May or something. He was wondering why the Japanese government were not more interested in tradable permits, because he had kind of heard about tradable permits in my course. so he said, he asked the question, how do you why don't you like the idea of tradable permits? And we were talking to this guy who was the head of Keidanren. He was an old man wearing dark sunglasses and looking like he came out of a film in James Bond. And he said, no need. We have a voluntary agreement. We take responsibility. We like clean environment. Japanese industry, very modern, very efficient. Yeah, but how about free riding? Suppose some industries, all the other industries abate, and how do you know, how do you know that the industries won't cheat? I looked at Lars, trying to over his glasses, and said, when I talk to industry listen. So that's how voluntary the voluntary agreement is. Basically, you want to belong to the club, you play by the rules. And imagine, you can't imagine, I mean, none of us can imagine the amount of money these guys have. Just imagine a long row of zeros and then a big, the Y for yen at the end. They control so much money, and they control that money because they work as a cartel. You know, cartels, like monopolies, have the power to raise prices. And if you have something like that, you don't want to disturb, you don't want to rock the boat. And you don't want the government to rock the boat. You don't really like the government too much. In fact, you sort of run the government. I mean, you have the Ministry of Industry is very powerful. It's called MITI. It's basically run by the Keidanden. You don't want the government to have a reason. And a few times they made mistakes. There were, you know, they had terrible pollution disasters in Japan. There was the Minamata, which was mercury poisoning. And it was mercury poisoning on a terrible scale. You had tens of thousands of people who were very seriously ill and stuff. If you have an incident like that, the government can say, hey, look, the government says, you know, the industry says they are responsible, but they are not. We have to go in and regulate it. They don't want that to happen. They don't want to give the government a reason to go in and regulate. Nor do they want the government to go in and tax, because after all, we're talking about B plus C here. Why would the Japanese industry, if they just can agree and do this voluntarily, they avoid the tax, they pay the abatement cost, and they don't have to pay this rent. I mean, if these curves are linear, that is roughly 1/3 of the cost, and you avoid 2/3 of the cost. So it's a pretty obvious thing to do. We might in fact be surprised that all industries don't do this everywhere, clean up voluntarily so that you don't have to have an environmental tax to force them. So I think that's the basic idea behind the voluntary agreement. And I've been fighting the last 2 years. And it's going to be even worse next week, because I'll be in Berlin locked up with my Taishi, my Japanese colleague, and we are writing, you know, we are fighting about the recommendations of the IPCC on policy instruments. And we want to say, most of us want to say that we need more, you know, powerful policy instruments. And he wants to say the opposite, that we don't need so much. You know, there is a lot of evidence, all Japanese articles about Japanese industries basically, saying that voluntary agreements work fine. So then we try to agree, sort of saying that voluntary agreements work fine in Japan. The rest of the world needs like environmental taxes or something else. Okay. I think there's a good reason why this might work in Japan, because it's you've got such a powerful cartel. Anyway, this table is in this book on page. I mean, I'm sure you've already seen it since you've read most of the book already. But in case you missed it, there we are, thank you, 200, page 200. So this is the top part of the table, and then it kind of continues. So you have these columns going down, and you'll see the next part. And I told you, I think in my first lecture, that I didn't like the table I had made of all the instruments. But I do like this table. I'm kind of pleased with it, because I think it makes an important point. The columns here are like who owns the environment, or who has the responsibility for the cleanup. So this is this actually means something, and then the rows also have meanings. So in that sense, it's a table that kind of works. And the bottom part of the table, there are instruments that we'll talk about in a moment. What kind of instruments, like tradable permits and subsidies and stuff. So I think this is an important legal, philosophical question. Who should kind of own the environment? And it goes back to the lecture that I had 2 days ago, I guess, on property. And I think there is a different feeling. The United States was fairly recently settled by people who found a virtually empty country, and sort of anyway, and then sort of established property rights and as individuals. This is my land. I own the minerals under it. I have the right to, if I want to dig up all the soil and sell it, I can do that. If I want to, I do anything on my land, and it's mine, and I own the air above it and the ground under it. Or if you have a country like these small feudal kingdoms in Europe that have been around for thousands of years, and where really everything used to belong to the king, and people somehow were given little rights to, it's okay, you can have your garden over there as long as you kind of behave and pay your taxes and are a part of society. But you don't have the right to kind of dig up all the soil and sell it because it's really not just yours. We have a society here, and there are neighbors who you must think of as well, and So if you think that the polluter has absolute rights, and I think the landowner has absolute rights. You sometimes hear the argument, that when there's unemployment today, as there is, let's say in the south of Europe, you can imagine if you are the owner of a factory, and you start talking to the town of any town, to Barcelona, to Granada, to Naples, Milan, not to speak of some town like Piraeus in Greece or something, and you say, well, maybe I am thinking of investing. You seem to have a nice port. I've heard you have a lot of good workers. They're all unemployed. Would you like me to come? What do you think the municipality says? Yeah, welcome. We'll do anything for you. You can have the land free. We're not really using it anyway, and we will, supply you with water and so on. And they would show them the drawing of the factory, and they would say, yeah, that looks great, And they would build their factory. Then 10 years later, maybe the town will come along and say, we don't like your smoke. We have to, regulate. You're not allowed to pollute. And they can say, well, hey, look, you asked us to come. You said we were welcome. We showed you a drawing of the plant. It's kind of obvious there's a chimney. That's because the smoke comes out. You can't make cement without smoke. So, you asked us to come. Now you're telling us we don't. You told us we can have the land. And that means the water and the air and everything as well. I think there is some logic to that argument. Although I kind of, personally, I gravitate towards this end of the spectrum, but one has to understand that there's a lot of logic to the idea that if you give a factory the land and ask them to come, then they make some noise and some smoke, and they use some water, and it's kind of the nature of industry. So you could argue that then it's really a matter of the payment. You can say, look, people here are the fish are dying because of your pollution. We want you to clean up. But we understand that you have the rights, so we will pay. So you can still get the cleanup, but then basically, like we buy products from the firm, we could also buy cleanup from them, and we could pay them the market price, T, or, well, you can think of it as a subsidy, S. They pollute this amount, and then we pay them. We pay them S for every ton of pollutant that they stop emitting, that they remove with the filter. And so we are paying for their costs D. And then we are actually giving them a little profit F as well, which is quite analogous to the profit they get over here, because it's the lower one price. And you, as long as these marginal costs have a slope, you get a little profit there. So, if you believe that the polluter really has the rights, we can still get the cleanup, and then basically society should pay D plus F. So we have that case over here. Society pays D plus F. The benefit is always D plus F plus G. Here the polluter is making a profit F, because the polluter has real cost D, but then it gets paid D plus F. Now you might say that this is kind of crazy. They shouldn't be making a profit. But you can say the polluter has some sort of relative rights, so that at least we might pay for their cleanup. So that's quite quite a common instead. There are many different kinds of subsidies, right? So the subsidy scheme 1, you pay them a price S per ton of cleanup. Then they make this profit F. Another subsidy scheme 2 is you just buy the filters for them, basically, and then society pays D and gets the cleanup, and there is no profit. Of course, this is simple diagram. In reality, it will be somewhere in between, typically. Also, in reality, we're not quite sure where these cost curves are, so there's some asymmetric information. The company knows more about the costs, and society doesn't. So there's also some room for playing. This is an intermediate concept. The OECD has decided on something called PPP. Actually, PPP can mean different things. But do you know what PPP is in this context? Polluter pays principle, exactly. It could also be purchasing power parity, but it's kind of something else. Polluters pay principle. But that isn't actually very precise. We start thinking about where is the polluters pay principle here? Well, the minimum must be that the polluter pays D. Right? So then what rights does the polluter have? Well, then the polluter has the right to a certain amount of the environment. Right? Just like they have a right to a certain amount of land. Volvo has the right to a certain amount, and that doesn't mean they own the whole of Gothenburg. So they could have a right to pollute the air up to a certain reasonable level, like the level often called best available technology, BAT, or best available control technology, BACT, or, well, there's lots of abbreviations for this. It's also, a lot of environmental legislation is written like that. You have the right to a certain amount of pollution, but you have the obligation to make this pollution as small as is reasonably and economically possible, or technically possible, or all kinds of different legal words there. So that's kind of, so you have the right to emit E0, but not the right to emit EU. And so you have to pay D yourself. That's polluters pay principle number one, is basically you pay D. And then polluters pay principle number two is like, well, if the company wants to buy water, suppose, the refineries, they use a little water. Well, first they have to pay for the equipment that economizes on the water, and then they have to pay for the water. That's kind of normal. So that's the normal way. So then, first you have to pay for like the filters so you don't pollute too much, and then you also have to pay this rent. So polluters pay principle 2, the full cost is B plus C plus D, which is here. Then the polluter pays for the filters and the economic pollution rent, and society gets this profit of selling the rent, the B plus C. And this column is just always D plus F plus G. That is the benefit of doing something about the environment. So that's the same in all the columns. So now we can get down to the next part of the table. The minus, yeah, I agree that the word cost and the word minus is, you might say, a little strange. And my sign convention here is perhaps a little strange. But it is consistent in the way that positive numbers here are profits. So here there is a profit, here there is a cost for the polluter. So it's consistent within the table. It's just, you could say that the word cost and negative that's not very good. So if I'd been very, if I wanted to be very precise mathematically here, I would have written the economic effects for the polluter of the instrument, here, because cost and then a negative number isn't really, But that's the trouble with tables. You kind of have to squeeze in one word. Right? But I've been thinking about this table quite a lot. Right? So now we can use those columns. And these columns, I think, really have some interesting meaning. Now I'm going to tell you about these two columns here. Oh, by the way, did you have a lecture with Jessica about Marty Weitzman's article from 1974, P versus Q? She mentioned it, okay. I mean, the thing is, I've been giving this course for 25 years or something, and originally, I guess, when I taught that part of I had a whole lecture on that. I mean, you don't need a whole lecture, you can. But I hope everybody understands it's a pretty fundamental issue, whether you should have regulation or a price type mechanism. And you all got the main idea. When do we choose a regulation and when do we choose a price type instrument? The issue that Weitzman analyzes in that article is when there is uncertainty about the abatement cost and about the damage cost. And so you don't know where the slopes are exactly, but you know how much they slope. And so if the damage curve is steeper than the benefits curve, then you use one instrument. And if the benefits curve is steeper than the damage curve, you use the other instrument. Does anyone know which is which? That's the vital point of the most important article, most famous article, I think, in almost in environmental economics. Maybe I should improvise going through that a little bit again in the next. Hey! There we are. Very good. You got it right. This is like one of these things. I am one of these guys who has a great difficulty in remembering which is left and which is right. Debit and credit was a nightmare when I was doing business administration, and I managed to do an exam once, everything the opposite way around. Of course, gave the same result, but it still gave me no points on that exam. So I have this problem of also, but there is a simple rule for thinking about this. If the damage curve is really steep, that means that if you get a little bit more emissions, then what happens? Really dangerous. That's what a steep damage curve means. So, for instance, arsenic. There is, of course, some doses, which is okay. And I've heard that in old times, if you wanted to sell a horse, you gave them this tiny, tiny, tiny dose of arsenic, because it actually kind of made the horse jump around and look like he was not so old and tired, and so people would think that's a strong horse, and so they would pay more for it. But if you give them too much, a horse is dead, right? So if the difference, between 1 microgram and 2 micrograms is death, then we don't really want to play around with finding the optimal tax and think, $75 per gram, and then, we got the level wrong, all the horses are dead. So then we want to go for regulation, right? And just say like 0 grams of arsenic allowed in drinking water or whatever. The same thing kind of happens with if the benefits are very steep. Suppose when the Soviet Union collapsed, or take East Germany, when there were like several thousands of factories that were basically uneconomic, and if you put in a pollution tax that was too high, they would all go bankrupt. And then all the workers would have, voted to go back to socialism. And the cost would have been really high. Right? All these people unemployed. And so it's the same thing there. If the cost to getting the wrong shadow price is very high, then if you set the regulation in the wrong place, you don't know quite how much a certain regulation really costs. But if you choose a price instrument, you do know the cost. So then you can choose a small fee, for instance. This fee, the companies will survive. It might not really get us the right level of pollution, but at least the companies won't all go bankrupt. So then it's better to choose the price type instrument. So you choose the instrument with the less steep sort of curve. And the reason for that is to do with triangles, because if you don't know where this curve is, maybe it's here, maybe it's there, and then you can illustrate this with triangles. Maybe I'll see if I can find a diagram for that in a moment. Just to say that this is one of the big divides, is between price type instruments and quantity type instruments, between taxes and regulation, for instance. And now I get to the main point of this diagram, this table, whole exercise. It might be just in time for the break. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So let me just say this. People compare taxes with permits, and they sort of assume that if you're going to have, as I say, taxes are a price type instrument. Permits are a quantity type instrument. But people also assume that taxes are going to be given away for free. Whereas the price type instrument, they assume that the money is going to the government. And then they analyze these two instruments and compare them, and they're mixing up two different aspects. One is we want to choose between a P and a Q type instrument. And that choice we want to make after reading Marty Weitzman's 1974 article, and it's about uncertainty, right? Then also we want to choose whether we think that the people own the environment or the polluters own the environment, and who should get the rent. That's a separate dimension. And you don't have to mix them up, because if you think that the polluter should always pay everything, then you can choose a tax, or you could choose auctioned permits. If you think that the polluters, the business owns the world, you don't have to choose permit trade. You can choose subsidies or refunded emission payments. That also it's a price type instrument, but it gives the rent to business. Well, either all of it or some of it.